Okay, welcome to today's Gender, Climate Change and Nutrition Integration webinar that focuses on programmatic highlights as well as the way forward. The event will last 90 minutes today. It will start with a presentation of the key work streams of the GCAN program, followed by lessons learned. Following this, we will have a Q&A session. Please add all of the questions that you might have in the chat box as you listen to the presentation. If you have a specific question for one of the presenters, please add that name as well. So I'll start now first giving a quick introduction to the exciting list of presenters that we have this morning. First is actually myself, Claudia Ringler. I'm the Deputy Division Director in the Environment and Production Technology Division at the International Food Policy Research Institute, and I'm also coordinating the GCAN initiative. Our second speaker is Dr. Meredith Zoll. She's the Technical Division Chief in the USAID Bureau for Food Security's Country Strategy and Implementation Office. Meredith was instrumental for getting the GCAN initiative started, and she has provided guidance throughout our program's existence. Our next speaker is Jaewoo Koo. He's a senior research fellow at IFPRI with more than 20 years of experience in geospatial analysis and crop modeling for agriculture research and development. His role in relation to GCAN is that he has been bringing data scientists together to pore over Feed the Future data sets, bringing together climate change, gender, and nutrition results. Our next speaker is Greg Seymour, who has dedicated much of his research work on the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index. For the GCAN initiative, he has focused on linking this index with a series of climate-smart agriculture technologies. The following speaker is Elizabeth Brine. She's a senior scientist at IFPRI and focuses her work on trade-offs and synergies across the intersection of climate-smart agriculture, nutrition, gender, and the environment. In GCAN, she has been instrumental in the development of the GCAN framework, which is a conceptualization of the climate signal, climate change impacts, the role of women in addressing these impacts, and nutrition implications and entry points. Our final speaker is Ruth Meinzendick, a senior research fellow at IFPRI. She has been the long-term guidance and supporter of the gender component of all GCAN activities. And now I will hand over to Meredith Zoll to tell us a little bit about the background and history of the GCAN project.
Thank you, Claudia, and welcome everyone who's joining this webinar from around the world. Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are. So USAID BFS initiated the GCAN project a few years ago to help break down the silos within our own teams working on gender, nutrition, and climate-smart agriculture, to look for the synergies and gain a better understanding of the linkages between gender, nutrition, and climate challenges, especially at the country level in our focus countries. More recently, we have also added a focus on youth integration. So GCAN has had three main activities since its inception. One of those is supporting USAID missions and partners to understand the linkages between gender, climate, and nutrition in alignment with the Global Food Security Strategy and the GFSS results framework, which is on the screen and shows the results framework for the overall initiative and how these different areas fit in. An example of this line of work is the in-depth analysis of projected future changes in temperature and precipitation in countries such as Nigeria, including modeling those changes on projected crop yields and linking to potential impact on gender and nutrition to inform programming. GCAN is also more generally engaging in research around the intersection of climate, gender, and nutrition, as exemplified in the GCAN framework, which serves as a tool to help better understand the linkages among the three areas at multiple scales and over different time horizons. We'll be hearing more about that later. And also last week's webinar on climate impacts on aflatoxins, and thus on gender and nutrition, is another example of this line of work. And that webinar will be posted soon if you missed it. Thirdly, GCAN has worked to make some Feed the Future data sets more readily available and usable by researchers interested in exploring these issues. GCAN hosted datathons in DC and Dhaka, Bangladesh, using the Bangladesh Feed the Future population-based survey data sets, where a diverse set of partners generated analyses and infographics on the intersection of climate change, gender, and nutrition, and left with new research ideas to pursue further in their own work. The GCAN team also led student competitions and mentored students to develop research papers using Feed the Future data on the intersection of these topics. I'm happy to turn this webinar over to the IFPRI team now to present in more detail their activities over the past few years and ideas for future activities aligned with USAID's new focus on the journey to self-reliance. Thank you.
Thank you, Meredith, for a great introduction on the background of GCAN. So before we go into some of the specific work streams, I think it's very important to know and to understand why are we focusing on integration here. This graph here shows one of it's work from one of the first research papers that we published, and it just shows a food value chain. So we know that climate change affects each and every step in the food value chain, from input supply to production to consumption and food utilization. A lot of work in the agriculture space is going on making each of these steps more climate resilient. But if we don't also consider the gender and nutrition perspectives of climate change along the food value chain, we might well increase food production, but actually achieve lower nutritional outcomes. And this graph shows various steps on the nutrition side where we can maximize nutrition outcomes despite climate change in the value chain, and other steps where we can minimize adverse nutrition impacts along the value chain. So this is just one of the many reasons why GCAN was established and why we need integration. Another example is the aflatoxin example that Meredith also just mentioned, and just last week we had a very successful aflatoxin webinar. Aflatoxin risks, as we have shown in GCAN, are increasing with climate change, and others have shown that as well. There is also very clear evidence that increased aflatoxin risks will further increase nutrition and health impacts, and we talk about negative impacts. The other important element of aflatoxins is that women have key roles in the entire crop value chain that is affected by aflatoxins, such as groundnuts, which you can see in the picture. Sorry, you can see in the picture now. So what are the challenges here? A lot of work has been going on by agricultural scientists to address aflatoxins, but as long as this work only focuses on agricultural science directly and doesn't integrate nutrition and gender perspectives, such as changing dietary diversification, increasing the diets away from just maize and groundnuts, for example, and as long as the roles and the agency of women in post-harvest processing of these value chains are not being addressed, we might well not really be able to address the aflatoxin challenge going forward. A second example is small-scale irrigation. Farmers have for a long time told us that they feel that small-scale irrigation is their preferred and the key adaptation strategy to address the climate change challenge. However, we know that technologies are more likely to reach men, And we also know that nutrition benefits, while very likely, are certainly not guaranteed if we don't incorporate a nutrition focus. Thus, multiple benefits can be achieved if we focus on integration. But if we only focus on irrigation as a technology, we might well not achieve these multiple outcomes. The last example of why integration matters is just to understand and to better examine the complexity in the wider ramifications, for example, here of climate extremes beyond food production. Just this year, using Feed the Future data from Bangladesh and northern Ghana, we published a paper that shows that multiple season excess rainfall was linked with more hunger in Bangladesh, probably not surprising because it's a relatively wet country, and less hunger in northern Ghana. So we could just say that's it, and we can, we can close the book, and it's good if we have more rainfall in one place and less in the other. But what we have also found is that even so, we have less hunger in northern Ghana, undernutrition actually increased. So again, we have to consider the full nutritional impacts of climate extremes, because undernutrition might have increased because of waterborne diseases, maybe roads were washed away because of the too much rain in that region. So it's important to think much broader, to look at a much larger set of entry points, and here it was done by linking data sets with climatic variables for integrated programming. And with this data analysis, I'll hand over to Javu Ku, who has worked together with data scientists on Feed the Future data.
Right. So to properly analyze these 4 different domains of data, nutrition, gender, agriculture, and climate, in early days of the GCAN project, we started putting together all the available data sets, the best of the data set for each of the domains, and develop harmonized and ready to use, ready for research on our data set. Not only we use those data sets in our internal research and also working with our partners, we also organize this event called Datathon, where we invited every data scientist and students and just general public who is interested in using this, understanding this data, and provide this kind of guidance on how we use this data at IFPRI and with our research partners, and also how they can also investigate by themselves to learn more new insights. We organized 2 datathons in 2017, one in DC and one in Dhaka. Combined, we had about 150 participants from 42 institutes represented. And the data set we developed through the process was based on Bangladesh integrated household survey data set, which was already available in the open data repositories, but by linking those data sets with other domains of our more rich data set, we were able to show this datathon participants what additional analysis can be done. We also selected 2 winning kind of datathon analyses from each of these datathon. One participant looked at gender and children's health outcomes in a little bit new with new different methods, and also another participant looked at public speaking, which was part of the gender empowerment data, and also linking that with children nutrition. And again, it was quite new approach and new methodologies that we haven't thought of, but by working together with participants, we were able to kind of discuss together what additional insight we can gain.
So you're determined, so it's hard to see those trends in that.
Okay, so reviewing, so maybe Shamiana, 5 minutes.
This is my first time attending these kinds of events, and I found it very inspiring as well in terms of both the content, linking agriculture, climate, nutrition, and trying to make use of available data to better understand the causality or relationship between these 3 areas. And in terms of the technical aspect of it, I found it very interesting that people were providing different data visualization tools, so it was very good.
But it was interesting to me to see people, like in few minutes, jump into the questions and then try to find answers. So yeah, that was very interesting.
This is my first time using Tableau.
Even though you said it was your first time using Tableau, you actually showed me what Tableau could do out of this. Slides also, and presentation. So, yeah. And finally, you clearly have no problem in speaking in public. I hope you and the rest of you will be inspired to continue probing some of these issues. So congratulations. Thank you.
So basically we are a community of professionals, scholars, or practitioners in these fields that basically fosters that kind of culture of intellectual sharing.
Okay, so next, I'm presenting quickly 2 slides on what additional analysis is we introduced into GCAN, which is around the climate change impact. More kind of near term on what countries and our policymakers in those countries really need to look into and better understand. For example, this map is showing kind of predicted change in length of a rainy season to 2025. So especially for Nigeria, for example, when we say climate change will influence agriculture and change general climate this and that way, we often hear very generalized terms, generalized analysis at country level or regional level. But when you go into more detail within country, there are a lot of spatial variability and nuances that you can also take a look into. And these are the analyses that we have been developing, also sharing with our partners. For example, this one is showing within Nigeria, although generally speaking, the length of rainy season is decreasing, especially in different, like the southern western part and northeastern part. There are pockets of central part, it may also increase, and those are in fact statistically significant. So this kind of different inside information within a country, especially explicit analysis, can also inform better policy making and planning of investment for the agriculture. When you overlay that information with,
Here, it's fine.
Okay, so next slide will show the overlay of the climate information on agricultural area and specifically agricultural productivity, in this case rain-fed maize and cassava. And then you can see which area may suffer more from those productivity loss due to climate change than other areas. Again, these types of modeling analysis itself may be a little bit difficult to understand and incorporate into ongoing program, but we are trying to bring them together in this GCAN framework to better inform part of this discussion in the field. Okay. Right. So the next slide is showing that relatively there are different general circulation models and different scenarios, and they all affect different crops differently. This kind of information is available in research domain, but they are making it easier to understand and presenting it in plain language to our policymaker has been also very important component of GCAN program. This chart is especially showing the yield impact in Nigeria's leading rain-fed crops under 2050 climate. And you can see different climate scenario. Depending on which climate scenario and climate model, you may get a little bit different kind of outlook. And this information was presented in more visual way to help a policymaker to use in the discussion. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Jawu. I'm going to present a few highlights from GCAN research. This first piece of work from Alex DePinto and colleagues looks at the effects of risk in understanding the impacts of climate change on crop production in Zambia. So there's 2 main pieces to this. The first uses household survey data to look at how changes in the volatility of crop revenues affect farmers' decisions about how much land to allocate among different crops. What they find is more or less in line with what we know about risk aversion among smallholders. All else equal, an increase in the volatility of crop revenues leads to a decrease in the area allocated to that crop. So what they do next is they use simulations to extrapolate these findings onto an economy-wide scale. Basically, they're modeling what they would expect to happen to crop production in Zambia over the next 30 years, given changes in the yield volatility of different crops and expected changes in temperature and precipitation. The headline result here is that accounting for farmers' risk-coping behavior in models like this matters quite a bit. So what they find in particular is that reducing yield volatility has a significant impact on country-level production and then, by extension, on nutrition and nutrient availability. In particular, the model is predicting a very large reduction in maize production. Thinking big picture in terms of policy and programming, the lesson is pretty clear. Reducing risk for farmers, for example, through new, less volatile crop varieties or crop insurance, can lead to significant positive outcomes in terms of both production and nutrition. So, somewhat related to Alex's work in Zambia, this next piece of research from Alex, myself, and Elizabeth looks at how women's empowerment can increase resilience to climate change. Specifically, we look at the impacts of women's empowerment measured using the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index, or WEA, on crop diversification using household survey data from Bangladesh. The motivation here is twofold. So on one hand, we know people's nutritional status does not solely depend on their own production. So in other words, production diversity doesn't always equate to a more diverse and nutritious diet. On the other hand, there's a large body of evidence that demonstrates a positive link between women's empowerment and improved nutrition. So what we're trying to do in this study is kind of bridge the gap between these two bodies of evidence. I'm assuming everybody's a little bit familiar with the WEA, but quickly, if not, it's a survey-based tool that measures women's empowerment using 10 indicators across 5 agricultural domains: production, resources, income, leadership, and time. It has an individual component which looks at women's individual achievements across these indicators, her score, as well as a household component that compares women's achievements to men's. So in this study in particular, we just focus on the individual component. What we find is that there is a positive linkage between a woman's empowerment score and crop diversity within her household. So in particular, a shift away from cereal production towards other crops. So kind of as a side note here, one of the advantages of the WEA is that it's decomposable. So in the context of this study, what this means is that we can look at how the individual indicators within the WEA affect crop diversification. And when we do this, what we see is that this overall positive effect we observe is mostly driven by improvements in 2 of the WEA indicators. So women's participation in production decisions, such as what crops to plant, and group membership. What's also interesting is that women's control over assets appears to move in the opposite direction. So crop diversity declines as women's control over assets increases. One of the way we explain this in the paper is in terms of a general trend in Bangladesh in which women in wealthier households, for reasons having to do with social status, tend to disengage from agriculture. But the bottom line despite these conflicting influences within the WEA, the net impact is still positive. So what we see is that the more empowered women are, the more likely their households are to produce a diversity of crops. In terms of the broader policy implications of this, I think the news is pretty promising, as it suggests that women's empowerment may be a way to positively impact nutrition outcomes based on the large body of evidence that we've out there, as well as lower risk exposure to climate change. Kind of an added benefit to this study in particular is it also provides a very nice case study on how to properly analyze the way. So shifting gears, didn't realize I just did that. We're going to talk about mechanization. The next piece of work, so this was conducted jointly between researchers from IFPRI and CISA, that's the Cereal Systems Initiative for South Asia. Specifically, we're looking at the reaper harvester. It's a relatively new technology being promoted by CISA in Bangladesh. There are a couple different models offered. Both promise to significantly reduce time and costs involved in the harvesting of rice and wheat. Typically, the cost runs between $500 and $2,000 US. So this is a mixed method study combining various quantitative data sources with 2 rounds of qualitative data collection we carried out in 2017 and 2018. So one innovative aspect of this study is we talked with both with men and women farmers on the clientele side, so who have recently hired these machines, as well as on the business side, so husband and wife couples who operate as machine service providers. I'm going to share a few key findings here on this slide, and then in the next slide I'll talk a little bit about the kind of broader implications of this. So first, we did find, talking to men and women, that we found that there were strong gender-based challenges involved in both hiring these machines, as well as in accessing the potential business opportunities presented by them. These included for women difficulty learning or accessing information about the machines, insufficient access to capital or finance to invest in these machines. So the upfront cost is still too high for many women. And a general lack of family or community support for women's involvement in paid work in general, and machine service providing in particular. All of these, in one way or another, can be traced back to the existence of some very strong cultural norms in Bangladesh, which discourage women from spending time with strangers or from traveling or working outside the home. Women noted this especially, that this lack of exposure to the public makes them unconfident about their ability, their general knowledge of the world, and their ability to make sound business decisions. And this was also often a reason the women provided for not feeling capable of starting a business. A somewhat surprising finding was that many women are already involved in mechanized service provision, though often in less visible behind-the-scenes aspects, such as bookkeeping and other tasks that don't require interacting in public. I'll talk a little bit more about this on the next slide. There were numerous benefits noted by men and women associated with hiring a reaper. And not all of these were that obvious to start with. For one, women valued the time savings in an interesting way. So hiring wage laborers often requires a substantial time commitment from women, who are expected to cook and supply food for the workers during the length of the engagement. So hiring a reaper completely relieved women of this burden. Additionally, women valued the cost savings. So reaping with a machine costs about half as much as harvesting by hired wage laborers. Interestingly, women said the extra savings they felt like they provided an opening within decision making within their household for them to have greater say. So a couple of kind of indirect benefits here that. Thinking about what this tells us about closing the gender gap in women's access to technology kind of in general, 4 themes kind of emerge. First is there's a need to kind of question the meaning of ownership over technology. So though men are often considered owners of agricultural machines, this doesn't mean that their wives don't participate in the day-to-day running of these businesses. In fact, like what we saw is despite strong cultural norms in Bangladesh, many women are already playing important roles in these businesses that could be further strengthened with training, which is the second point here. So the importance of prioritizing joint ownership and joint training. So another interesting thing that we found was that married women don't necessarily want to be individual owners of machines. Rather, they prefer to have their to own the machines with their husbands, to have their support, and rather than have to assume the risk of owning and operating the business by themselves. Even more surprising, though, was that men reported feeling the same way and openly recognized how their wives helped them in the businesses. So one example that was given is that working together as a couple reduces the risk involved if one of you becomes sick or unable to manage the business. So joint training and ownership could be an effective way to promote this sort of risk sharing and also increase women's skills, knowledge, and say in the business, and help kind of reverse the trend of them not feeling of the lack of confidence. Another point here is, so with the frequent migration of men out of rural areas into looking for more urban employment, women farmers really represent an untapped market of demand for machinery services if they're offered at the right price and women are actually able to learn and access these services. So even to this end, women service providers themselves may be better positioned than men or project staff to reach out to other women through their networks and other groups. So women's self-help groups may be another kind of untapped way to promote these. And finally, the work revealed kind of the importance of recognizing agricultural machinery as both a business and service to farmers. And I think this is something I think that's very important for programming to understand and to seek to understand differences in men's and women's ability to not only use technologies but also access the business opportunities presented by the machine. Finally, I'm going to talk about some ongoing work we're doing to understand youth resiliency to climate change and how to integrate youth into programming. So this is based on focus group discussions and semi-structured interviews we carried out earlier this year with young men and women, mostly between the ages of 18 and 30 in 2 states in Nigeria. So, like I said, this is in progress. We're still in the process of analyzing the transcripts. We thought it would be useful to share a little of what we're already seeing to demonstrate kind of this new direction to GCAN. To begin with, more than half the youth in the sample expressed aspirations and interests related to agriculture, both as a means of earning income and securing employment, as well as a source of food security. For some, agriculture was viewed as the only viable opportunity for employment within their community. Their aspirations tended to focus on a desire for mechanization as a means of reducing the stress involved in farming and more lucrative large-scale farming. And conversely, kind of a lack of modern farming technology was seen as one of the main reasons for disinterest in agriculture, as well as insufficient government support and access to input. So moving on to thinking about the constraints faced by younger farmers, older farmers tended to be perceived as more established and as having several advantages over younger farmers, including larger support networks and more numerous and diverse income sources. Having older children who could assist on the farm was also seen as an advantage. Some of the other constraints most identified as youth-specific included startup capital, access to land, inputs, modern farming equipment, finance, and information. Last, some of the findings kind of around resilience and coping. So perhaps not that surprising, participants had no trouble recalling a range of climate shocks in recent years, including floods, high temperatures, low rainfall, and droughts. There were contrasting views given on whether it was older or younger farmers who were better able to cope with shocks. Some viewed older farmers as more able to cope due to experience and greater reserves, while others saw younger farmers as more able to take on hard labor and to recover from shocks due to better health. I'll end with three, I think, interesting smaller findings, which I think have potential to be very useful for thinking about how to integrate youth into programming and how to tailor projects to specifically fit the needs and interests of younger farmers. So first, while few individuals had ever heard of agricultural insurance, nearly all expressed interest in it when it was explained. They all viewed it as really valuable. Second, short-term migration. So for example, to find employment, overcome seasonality problems, and cope with shocks in general was perceived as a youth-specific mechanism and something older farmers were not as capable of. And lastly, younger farmers, especially those with more education, reported having a very high degree of technological savvy and a higher reliance on the internet as a source of information. So all three of those are potentially things to work into programming or ways to improve the targeting for youth. But like I said, this is still very much in progress. There's more work to do, and hopefully many more insights to draw out of this. And so I think look for a concept note or discussion paper on the GCAN website coming soon.
Thank you very much, Greg. I'm going to shift gears a little bit again to talk about what the GCAN project has done to build capacity, both through our mission engagements, but also through work with other partners. One of the key pillars of the GCAN project was our engagement with missions, and this engagement was done on a demand-driven basis. So we worked with colleagues in USAID DC office to identify missions who were interested in deepening integration of climate change, gender, and nutrition issues in their work. Often they were looking for support with ongoing reporting requirements or in advance of new strategies that they were developing to try and think through some of these issues. So what we would do is to further our work with them, we would initiate phone calls to understand the nature of their needs, and then we would engage in a synthesis using our framework, which shows the linkages between all of these issues, to synthesize existing data and research from the country, and if possible for the Feed the Future zone of influence, to try and pull out some of the key messages that would be important in their programming and in their planning. Then we would put together a team usually composed of a gender specialist, a climate specialist, and a nutrition specialist from IFPRI, and this team would then also be accompanied by staff from the USAID DC team, and we would spend a week in the country with the mission, presenting the synthesis, having a deeper staff engagement with different team members, and discussing research gaps that we found through this synthesis effort and trying to work with them to come up with ways that we could further support the work that they do when we came back home. And then when we returned to IFPRI, we would prepare project notes on the synthesis that we did and report on the kinds of research topics that emerged from this week-long engagement. And we would continue to respond to requests for information and report back on some of the work that we were doing with the mission. And the missions that we engaged were Zambia in October of 2016, and there, in each case, the nature of our engagement shifted depending on where they were in their process, the kinds of needs that they had at the time. So in Zambia, we mostly focused on synthesizing the sort of gender, climate change, and nutrition issues, using existing data for them in advance of their country strategy development. In Bangladesh, we supported them more with climate risk screening activities for their plans that they already had in place, and we helped co-identify research topics with them. In Cambodia, we had a more limited engagement along the sidelines of a USAID event on climate-smart agriculture, and we also had the opportunity to engage several other missions in Asia on these topics. In Nigeria, we also did more capacity building on climate risk screening with additional attention on gender and nutrition issues through this process. And we responded to specific requests for information. As you saw, Jawu earlier presented some of the climate maps that we prepared for them. And we now currently have this ongoing research on youth in Nigeria as well. So there's still ongoing work with these missions. And I'm just going to take a step back now to give you a very, very brief overview of the framework we developed, which was one of the key activities for the GCAN project. And we used it in many, many different ways, from framing the synthesis that we did in the Feed the Future countries to preparing research papers that tried to deal with an integration of these issues. And one of the key elements that we have going on now is to try and make it more operational for partners to be able to pick up and use. And so I'll just quickly walk through the framework, and then I'll talk about this what we're doing to operationalize it. So what this framework shows is that the impact of climate shocks and stressors on well-being outcomes is influenced by several elements. These include the level of exposure and sensitivity to disturbances, which can differ for different groups of people. It also relates to people's capacity to respond to shocks and stressors. And people have a range of capacities, and this often also differs by men and women and other social groups. And depending on the capacities, that influences the range of response options that people have. And the choices that they make also depends on their decision-making power, both within their own households as well as in the communities. And we find that, again, men and women seem to have different decision-making authority and different preferences for the types of responses that they choose. And finally, these response options that are chosen have implications for well-being outcomes like food and nutrition security, health, or environmental security, and they're affected along several different pathways, such as increasing or decreasing food production, or increasing income or assets, or changes in labor allocation in the family, as some of our papers have shown that were presented earlier. And then these well-being outcomes have implications for people's future resilience capacities. And one of the other things I want to point out is that nutrition is not only an outcome in this framework, but it's also an important input as well. So it affects, for example, people's ability to respond to climate shocks and stressors. It affects their sensitivity as well, because people in poor health and poor nutritional status are more susceptible to climate shocks. And importantly, some of the response mechanisms have important nutrition implications. So coping strategies often involve things like consuming less or less preferred foods, and that has negative implications for nutrition, while increasing crop diversification or increasing income by planting cash crops may have positive outcomes for nutrition. And so this framework has been really useful for us to help work with the missions and partners to understand a lot of these linkages and to identify research outputs. But we realized that without this kind of sustained and intense resource engagement, direct engagement with missions, it's difficult for people to pick it up off the shelf and use it and apply it to their own work. And while it really is no substitute for this kind of direct engagement and thinking through policy problems and thinking through the design of activities, it is possible to go a little bit deeper for people on their own, and we wanted to make that easier for them. So what we are doing now is we're in the process of developing a tool, which is an online interactive tool based on the framework that lets people not only understand the elements of the framework and how they're linked together, but to take it a step further to understand what are some questions that you might want to apply, and what are some of the ways that you might respond to those questions. What are some sources of data or information that you might call upon to look at this issue further. And so this is really just a mock-up at this point, but I'm going to click on it just to give you a flavor of what this tool is going to look like. So you'll come to a landing page here, which describes what the tool is intended to do. And then there's going to be a module that allows you to explore the framework. So for example, if you click on this element of the climate signal, it highlights the area of the framework that we're talking about. It gives you a definition, and it gives you why we think this is important for you to think about. And then if you want to go even further, you can click on how to apply it. And we have some key questions that you might want to consider, and then some other sources of information or ways in which you could answer these questions. And when you scroll down, we try to give some guidance on when you might think about doing this. Before you're designing an activity, if you're designing a new country strategy, this is when you want to think about these questions. And so the rest of the content for the elements will be filled out, and this will be one of the modules that we are going to use. And let me go back to the PowerPoint. The other thing that we're going to do is to try and get even more specific examples to help people really think through different project types. And these are key project types that are used across several different organizations, like USAID implements types of projects like this, as well as IFAT. And we're also working with IFAT to try and develop some examples that can help them in their work, because they're also going through a mainstreaming process at the moment. And so what we tried to show here is that not only are farmers making decisions to respond to the climate shocks and stressors that they're experiencing, but development organizations also have a role to play here through the design and implementation of programs to help support farmers, improve their well-being outcomes, and increase their capacity to respond to climate change. So what we're going to do is walk through several different types of projects in another module in this online tool and try to talk about how you can use the framework to build in some research and thinking about these mainstreaming issues at various stages of the project cycle. So before you even design your project, what are the kinds of questions and situation analyses that you can do? How would you react to that? How do you build in activities that think about gender, climate change, and nutrition throughout your design of your project? And how do you implement projects so that you're making sure that you're addressing all of these things? And then how do you monitor and evaluate the outcomes of these interventions? And I'm going to stop there and turn it over to Ruth to talk about the achievements and way forward of the project.
Thank you. Thank you. So there's been, I hope this has given you, sorry. Can you all see my screen? I hope. I hope this has given you a flavor for the wide range of products that we've been producing here. Some of them have been the journal articles that really, peer review to show the rigor of the work, but also a lot of policy notes to make it more understandable. We've also harmonized data sets that enable people to link the work that's been done on, for example, WEA data with GIS data on more biophysical things, so that you can understand the linkages to climate and nutrition also. We've done a lot of updates and mission engagements and participation in a number of related events, like the Cracking the Nut conference, reaching out to NGOs, USAID project implementers, and others. The problem we have in the process, it dealt with a lot of challenges in this integration. Gender, climate change, and nutrition are each pretty complex things on their own, and then trying to combine them all sometimes makes your head explode. And in this process, you get into some trade-offs between the potential gains in insights that you get versus needing to reduce each component and strip out some of the complexity of it. With some of the missions and implementers, there are competing priorities, and sometimes there's this notion that, well, it's just too complicated to do all of this, and capacity constraints at all kinds of levels, reporting requirements and all, and this is somewhat resource intensive. So how have we been dealing with this? I think it's been a combination of showing the generic, the framework that helps people identify the linkages, as well as specific examples that are of relevance to the programming that people are doing to show that this is in fact relevant. So we've given you the example. Elizabeth showed the overall framework, but the aflatoxins, for example, it shows that the climate is causing contamination, which has nutritional effects, but and the way of dealing with it is through diet diversification. But women play key roles in this, so you have to deal with that. And then I think one of the things that's been a strength of this is that we've used a lot of qualitative and quantitative data and geographic data to bring this all together. So sometimes the quotes from people dealing with this on the front line, like the one Nigerian man, convey something. Sometimes it's a map like Jawu showed of the specific areas of climate change. We've engaged a lot of new actors in this process. So we had this competition for student papers. The datathons brought out a lot of people with a lot of energy for trying to address these things in conjunction. Through the process of trying to deal with gender resilience, we've strengthened our relationship with Mercy Corps, for example, and the RESAX program, the Annual Trends and Outlooks Report for Africa last year had a thing on climate change. Our framework was really useful and has been applied now in the new coming one on gender. IFAD has also been picking up on some of this. They really liked the framework and felt that they could use it. So we're developing tools to help people identify these linkages themselves, as Elizabeth has described. But we're also finding that, for example, IFAD is wanting to use this in mainstreaming the notions of gender, climate change, and nutrition in the design of projects, in the supervision and M&E. So by integrating the three into the whole process, they feel that there may be more impact out of this. Then going forward, we do feel that gender, climate change, and nutrition are going to remain critical. We're focusing on operationalizing this, such as through the online tool, and more analysis of these linked data sets. Climate and WEA, for example, or climate and intimate partner violence. And we're going to be doing more datathons, including on Ghana, with the Feed the Future data sets. And we'll have partnering in these datathons with DataKind and Youth Mappers, as well as a virtual event After all, if we're dealing with climate change, we should be also mindful of our own climate impact and looking at more things we can do that are virtual, such as this webinar. And we're doing more to work with USAID partners to advance this integration. So we hope that you will visit our website, which has all of these publications and the tools and things like that. We thank you for your attention, and we look forward to the discussion. So I think now Elizabeth is collecting questions that have been submitted online, and I'll turn it back over to you, Elizabeth, for handling that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ruth, and thanks to everyone who presented today. So I'm just going to roll through some of these questions and direct it to the person indicated. So there's a question here for Jawu. It says, you indicated you have data that have been downloaded over 4,000 times. Is this open access data? And if yes, where can the data be found?
Yes, it is open access data. The data is housed in IFPRI's data repository for Dataverse, and you can find the link from our GCAN website. Yeah, which is on the screen at the moment. And yeah, as of now, actually, it's 4,700 times downloaded. It's one of the most popular data set from IFPRI. Yes.
Great. Another question is not directed to anyone, but maybe several, or Greg could answer. How much of women's time and energy are consumed with daily domestic needs, water, fuel, cooking, etc., and how much is available for economic activities? There's no country mentioned, but...
So this wasn't something that we explicitly looked at in any of the work I presented, but we touch on it a little bit in the with the mechanization work, and I don't have exact figures for you, but I mean a lot is taken up by the by domestic responsibilities, caring for children and the other household members, and the preparation of food. So I mean, in collection of water and firewood. So I mean, yeah. So we know those tasks take up a lot of women's time, and they're also less flexible. Those are things that have to get done, and it's not easy to replace those things. So there are obviously implications for how much time that leaves for economic activities.
I would maybe just add that I think the time allocation module in the WEA allows women to specify whether they're doing childcare alongside of other activities, because I think a lot of times these things are done in parallel. Absolutely. And I'm sure that if you look at time allocation modules across different countries where we've implemented the WEA, you might see a range in terms of the amount of time women spend in economic activities and domestic activities, and how their time gets allocated. Okay, another question is, can you separate climate change from normal variation in monthly or annual rainfall?
Right, very good question. We always compare the baseline period, any type of simulation result from the baseline period, which is 1960 to 1990 or sometime 2000, with multiple types of projection in the future. So we are not really looking at short-term variation monthly or daily or annually. It's more of multiple decades of climate data going into our simulation analysis, and we statistically analyze them to tease out all these kind of variation, short-term variations, and we focus more on long-term to mid-term kind of impact.
And there's a question regarding the use of reaper harvesters. Does this result in increased crop recovery with cleaner grain? And what is the extra value of this? And does it recover the cost of the equipment plus some additional amount?
So again, this is, I think there's, I would suggest looking at the discussion paper online for more details on this. I do know that the general sentiment among farmers was that it was very beneficial. That the saving, the cost and time savings that came with using the reaper harvester as opposed to hiring wage laborers was a kind of a clear gain for the household. I know that doesn't get into the specifics of the question, but
there's another question which I think relates to the mechanization paper. Individual ownership seems to have more benefits and sustainability compared to joint ownership. As the saying goes, the goat which everyone owns ends up spending the night in the bush.
So yeah, I take we take the point. The Bangladesh work, I think, one of the kind of the utility of that is that it. I don't think the point is to kind of take the downplay ownership, the importance of ownership, but I think it's more to emphasize that it's important, especially with machines that lend themselves to service provision, to think also about that, the roles that men and women can play and the ways they can benefit from, that business side of it. That was I think the really interesting thing that came out of that work was that one, women were already involved in that, and two, that men were like, this was an area where they were in agreement. Let's work together on this in the business.
And my understanding was that I just wanted to say my understanding was that it wasn't a group that owned the reaper harvester, but a family farm that would then provide the services to other farmers, in a pay per service kind of arrangement. So it wasn't a large group of farmers, for example,
although there were a few examples of it they found too. But I think they were primarily focused on the husband-wife couples kind of.
Right. Go ahead, Ruth.
Can I come in on this? Because I do a lot of research on ownership of individual, household level, and group ownership, and it's very important that we pay attention to what men and women prefer in different contexts, and not impose our perceptions of what is better. So what we are finding a lot in South Asia is that women do prefer to hold things jointly with their husbands, whereas in some places in Africa, women may prefer individual ownership of land. And one of the important things we're learning is that it's important to pay attention to whole households, not just and look that very often for women's empowerment, working with the whole household is an important strategy.
Yeah, this is Meredith. I'll just add like that. I think it really shows how important context is, and you can't do a study in one country and then say that's the case globally, because things do much differ around the world, which I think it also plays to the strengths of the framework, because it's to be used in a really specific context and the area you're working in, and trying to understand what those situations are and how to do that work. But it is very interesting to also learn across those different contexts what things are more similar and what things are more different, but then how we can work locally to achieve our goals.
I would add that it's maybe a strength but also a challenge, because I think when people see the framework and they know that they have to apply it to a specific context, it can be a bit daunting. And so that's exactly the reason why we tried to operationalize it a bit, give some clear examples, so that even if it's not relevant to your particular context, you can see how to walk through that sort of stream of thought to get at where you want to go, and it might help people be able to apply it and use it a bit more. And we hope that that's the case, and look forward to your feedback on that. Okay, there's another question which is more focused on nutrition. In your work on nutrition, how have you factored in the dietary needs to optimize the economic opportunities that is often largely related to heavy manual labor requiring over 4,000 calories a day? this is not available, if this is not available, what are the rational compromises people make to balance quality nutrition with optimizing economic opportunities? Typically, smallholder farmers have access to only half the calories they need for a full day of agronomic field work. This reduces the workday, prolongs the time it takes to complete tasks, and ultimately risks food security.
Yeah, maybe just a few words on how we have dealt with nutrition. So rather than focusing on an optimal number of calories, we have looked at diet diversification, we have looked at stunting, undernutrition, but also household food security, so a variety of metrics. And we fully agree that there's this big paradox that while farmers are actually producing the food, in many developing countries, it is still farmers, especially small-scale farmers, who actually face most of the undernutrition and food insecurity challenges. This is a situation that shouldn't exist, but it still exists, and that's why projects like GCAN are operating to see how we can address this challenge in an integrated fashion. And so some of the examples I think that you have heard today being presented, including this reaper harvester. So they're supposed to reduce some of the labor burden and the high energy intensity to work in farmers' fields through using machinery services. And so they have been proven to really reduce the time burden, and as a result also the nutrient intake requirements of small-scale farmers. Aflatoxins is another example. While the aflatoxins don't directly, they should reduce the calories you take in because you shouldn't be eating aflatoxin-infested crops, but farmers still eat them, farmers and their children. They're even found in baby formula. And so those impacts on adverse health impacts, liver cancer, etc., are very detrimental to nutrition and health of farmers. So basically, calories matter, but we have to go beyond calories. And so really, GCAN is there because of the multiple nutrition impacts from climate change.
Okay, there's another question here. Could you share an example of livestock-related work which GCAN has been involved with?
Yes.
Let Claudia take that one.
Yeah, I'll start, but then I'm sure USAID has many other examples on how livestock and climate resilience and nutrition and gender have interplayed. But so quickly, from the GCAN project, we have had a series of student challenge papers. So we've basically given out the call to students at universities who were interested to use Feed the Future data and to look at topics across climate, gender, nutrition. And one of the papers actually has focused on the consumption of animal source food in Bangladesh using that Bangladesh data set that has been downloaded so heavily. And they found that exposure to flood risk, so that is obviously a big challenge in Bangladesh, is unsurprisingly associated with decreased consumption overall, but also and specifically with reduced consumption of animal source foods. And what this student found is, Natalie Tays is her name, is that women's empowerment appears to be an important pathway towards increased consumption of animal source food, and particularly in households that currently do not own livestock. So there are important linkages again with women's empowerment to improve the consumption of animal source food.
And the next question is directed at Ruth and myself. Is there any interest in support or proposals for operationalizing the online tool, case studies, or project-based approaches such as agent-based modeling? I guess I'll start just to say that, we're certainly interested to work with other partners to help apply the framework or to come up with content that could be used in the framework, or to get feedback on how the framework is shaping up and how it might be made more relevant for the kind of work that you do, because we're still in the design phase of this, and we expect it to evolve over time as we hear from our partners about how they would benefit from using it. Ruth, do you have anything to add to that?
Just to say that if the questioner would like to follow up with us, we'd be very interested in talking about how this might, what their ideas are on that.
maybe this is a boy, and maybe also add in that if you have volunteers that want to test out the framework and provide feedback, that would be also
Absolutely.
welcome.
So yeah, this is Baboima from USAID who just spoke, and he's our current point of contact for the GCAN project. And he basically encourages all of you online to help us with improving and finalizing the operationalization of the framework by testing it out in relation to your own projects that you might be planning, questions that you might have on how to better integrate climate change and nutrition in your ongoing activities. I mean, either as an implementer or as an agency that is trying to mainstream these topics in their own organization.
This is Meredith, and I appreciate the rich discussion here that's generating lots of ideas. I wonder, because that was such a short introduction to the framework and that really piqued my interest, would you perhaps be able to think about doing a follow-on webinar for people who, groups who are interested in trying to apply it, where it could be a little bit more of, if you're trying to apply this, here's some kind of training.
Sure.
And then maybe there could be a follow-on meeting of some type where people who try to apply it, give a certain amount of time, and then people get together and say, okay, we tried to apply it, and this is what happened, and this is what we learned. And so if there's interest in something like that from anyone who's with us online, is there a way to contact you all through the website, or a specific email address you'd want people to use?
Yeah, we do have a web address that you can click on, and it'll send an email to a generic account. But you can also email me directly at e.bryan@cgr.org, and we'll be happy to link up. I think that's a great idea, and it will help us really make this the most useful tool that it can be. There's another question. How have national policies on smallholder farming, gender, nutrition, etc., been influenced through this integration initiative? Do we have any case studies? Ruth, if you want to take a first stab at that. Or I can also address it.
Yeah, why don't you, I don't think of national policies offhand.
Right.
It's been more at the programmatic level. But why don't you go ahead?
So the GCAN project was designed specifically to support missions, but we also found that as we went along, a lot of what we were doing would be relevant to implementing partners, working with USAID, as well as others such as IFPRI. And so we've expanded our focus from really just trying to support mission capacity to working with partners. But I think certainly we'd be willing to also interact with government agencies and officials, and we did do a little bit of that through our engagement with the RESACS network. We had a chapter that was presented to lots of different more technical people from ministries of agriculture from different countries in sub-Saharan Africa in 2017, and we have another engagement coming up this fall with the same group of policymakers. So at least at that level, we're trying to also build a greater understanding of the linkages between gender, climate change, and nutrition. And I'm not sure that that's translated into any specific policies, but we hope that people are at least taking some of these key messages back to the work that they're doing.
Yeah, and maybe to add, not solely through the GCAN project, but also through the small-scale irrigation innovation lab, we have focused on strengthening nutrition and some of the technological interventions, and there is irrigation. And the African Union, for example, is very interested to incorporate a much stronger nutrition angle into their new irrigation framework. So there is certainly a lot of interest now to consider the key aspects that everyone wants to, sees as the key end goals or important end goals for well-being. And so nutrition is a key one that I think now a lot of agriculture agencies understand that yield and production on their own, as we have shown, might support hunger, but not necessarily under nutrition goals. And so given those greater understanding of the nuances, there's now I think a very strong interest. But the challenge is, as I think we have heard, capacities, time, the additional time it takes to actually go through a longer series of questions and not just can I get a higher yield, yes or no. But I think at the same time there's an understanding that resources are limited, and if we don't make the best investments with the limited resources that we have, we will not be able to achieve key development goals such as the Sustainable Development Goals.
Okay, there's another question. Do you have studies in India or Pakistan? And then a request to please undertake a small study on women's efforts, I assume in agriculture. Our project mostly focused on Feed the Future countries that were interested in having our team come out to support them in integrating gender, nutrition, and climate change. And so India and Pakistan were not some of the countries that reached out for support, but we do have other projects in these areas, some related to, for example, in India, we have a project now looking at reaching women farmers with information on climate smart agriculture and what are some of the best extension approaches to do that. And that will look at some outcomes related to women's empowerment, although the nutrition angle may be missing from that particular study. But IFPRI is involved in a lot of other work in these areas that you may be interested to dig into. And there's one last question here. Too often, minor anomalies in climate are blamed on climate change when well within normal variation. Joe, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, which is also very actively a lot of research is going on. So, like for example, climate variabilities and events like ENSO and the El Niño and sudden oscillations. There are evidences that frequency and intensity might be increasing because of more moisture in the atmosphere because of global warming and climate change. But I mean, this is something we ourselves are not really actively undertaking. We rather work together with our climate scientists and CGIAR CCAPS program, Climate Change, Agriculture, and Food Security program, and other initiatives to better understand exactly how the climate projections are being made and formulated by climate scientists. But there are a lot of noises and difficulties to make exact prediction of future climate, especially on the variability. So, I take that as a good comment that we are actively engaging with climate scientists to better understand those dynamics.
If I'd like to add something, because I think one of the main messages from a lot of the analysis you as well as others have done is that regardless of changes in precipitation, we know that the temperature is increasing. And we have that information, I think, with great certainty that we've looked at it in the past decades and we look at it now, and even without predicting the future, it's already higher. And there are things we can be programming for higher temperatures, regardless of what we know or think we know about the changes in precipitation. And one of the very interesting lessons from the Nigeria work, if you looked carefully at those maps, is in the north, which is part of the Sahel. The predictions are actually for increasing precipitation. So there's, I think people often say that the desert is expanding, and yet with climate change, the prediction is that there would be more rain there. So it would, although there's certainly more uncertainty around the precipitation than there is around the temperature, it is still something to think about, that while we have this additional knowledge with some level of uncertainty, but how do we think then about programming for increased temperature and potentially more rain rather than less in those areas?
Great, and we had a couple of questions come in. One is, do you think there is a relationship between a woman's level of education and their ability to cope with climate change, whether as an individual or as a family? Greg, do you want to take that one?
So the short answer is I think certainly. It's not, education isn't something that is measured in the way. We think of it as a more of an indirect or a resource for greater empowerment. But we do know that the WEA is highly correlated with with education. So I think that's like, and I think it's certainly the case that more educated women are gonna be more resilient and better able to cope with climate change.
And of course, we know that climate change also affects the likelihood and the possibility of getting an education. So if there are no resources at home, I mean, when we look at short-term coping responses with climate change, it's eating less or taking children out of school, moving away seasonally, or even beyond. And all of these are huge huge education interrupters. And obviously look at overall climate-related migration is also a huge disruptor to the possibility of getting an education. And then, which obviously next generation makes it again more difficult to adapt to the changing climate. So yeah, there's very strong linkages in both directions.
Yeah, exactly. I would also add that, education is one of the key factors that influences people's capacity to respond to climate shocks and stressors, and specifically, access to information about agricultural technologies, climate smart practices, weather data, and forecast information. All of these things are especially critical that women have access to them so that they can make informed choices in ways that will not only increase their own resilience, but also of their families and communities. And there's another question here. Better not be a farmer, as it would be a conflict of interest between farming and service business. Maybe this relates to the mechanization study. I'm not quite clear what that question refers to. Yeah, I'm not, and I don't know if it was analyzed whether the service providers in the case of the reaper harvester businesses were also farming on the side. That's not something that I think the study looked at in particular. And there's one last question here. Do you have studies on the impact of gender in China? Again, that's not one of the countries that we worked with through this project. And Ruth, do you have any knowledge of any gender-related studies in China?
I know that there is a large literature on that. We have not been involved in any of that. So, yeah.
Okay. And so I think if we don't have any other questions, we've gone through the list here. I'll go ahead and thank all of the participants who joined us online and, in various parts of the world for joining us today. And we really hope that you follow up with us and go to our website, check out our publications, use the data sets, contact us if you're interested to explore ways to apply the framework or to work together on new projects, or get our support in helping to integrate these issues into work that you're already doing. We welcome new partnerships and new opportunities, and we look forward to the next event. Thank you very much.